Tom Henderson is our current guest. He is the founder of Graceful Willow Productions. He's been down to Antarctica several times. His film that's coming out, Ice Eagles, an account of American aviation in Antarctica, is due out late this year, early next year. Again, Tom, thank you so much for giving up some time to share your experiences and your work and what you're doing with our audience tonight.
It's, again, my pleasure.
Some other questions that came in for you, some interesting ones, too. Was Tim writes in, this was an interesting one. Tim writes in and says, Tom, what happens if you pass away down there? Are there cemeteries, or do they fly the bodies back?
Well, I don't know that I'm an expert on that part of it, but as far there have been burials there, both intended and unintended. And when I say unintended, an example would be when they were building the first station at McMurdo. They drove tractors across the ice from where the ships were able to tie up, because at that point they couldn't. The breakers weren't as powerful as they are in later years. They would tie the ships up and then tractor in the supplies to where the station was being built. And the later in the season it got, the weaker the ice became. And one of the tractors plunged through the ice at one point, and the driver went down with the tractor, and is still there, and the tractor is still there. There have been other incidents where people and machines have fallen into crevasses, and it was simply not feasible to recover the body.
Right.
There are other cases where I know of one specifically, a scientist who had done his life's work on the ice in Antarctica, and he had requested that his ashes be scattered at the South Pole, which they were. Mm-hmm. So it's rare, but it does happen in almost all other instances. If there are deaths there, the body is returned, as you would expect, to the family and taken care of in the States.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, again, just like, I was, of course, with the devastating earthquake that took place in Nepal. My heart goes out to those people. The city was just, the town, the country was just, I don't know how they're ever going to recover from that. Just beautiful structures that are just disintegrated. And, of course, the quake was strong enough that it caused an avalanche on Mount Everest. And, Everest is, again, it's kind of, it's probably very similar to Antarctica in the wintertime, the conditions that they experience up there. But a lot of programs about Everest on this week here on television, and all the bodies that are on Everest, all the people that just didn't make it, and in so many cases, it's just too dangerous to recover them.
Yeah, it's an awful thing, but it's nature on exhibit.
Exactly.
The powerful forces that we have to deal with.
Exactly. Julie writes in and says, Tom, I had a family member that was on board an airplane called the Pegasus, a C-121 Lockheed Constellation that crashed near McMurdo. She said, can you talk about that?
Yes, it's one of a number of crashes that took place in the McMurdo area, and this was out on the sea ice. There's actually two runways. Now there's three, but at that time there were. You had the runway that was created on the sea ice during the early part of the summer, and that eventually breaks up and goes out. And then there's a permanent runway up on the Ross Ice Shelf south of McMurdo, which operates after the sea ice goes out, as well as before. But the crash that she's speaking of, I believe it was 1970, but I'd have to go back and look at my notes again. But it was a 121 Constellation, and the Connies were known to be very susceptible to crosswinds. and the winds down there are entirely unpredictable. As the plane was approaching, from what I can gather, conditions began to deteriorate around McMurdo. Winds picked up, and as it was attempting to make the landing on the ice, the crosswinds destabilized it. A wingtip hit the ice. It pretty much cartwheeled and disintegrated. Although there was, I don't believe they actually had any loss of life on that one, which is astounding. But that was one of the more serious crashes down there, and there were a number of others. The first flight in 1956, I believe it was November of '56. Was a P-2V Neptune. Was a turboprop plane. It came in, made a pass over the runway and that was sort of standard procedure. You'd make a pass over the runway, assess the conditions, the references, see what the visibility was like, swing around, and then make the actual landing approach. But the pilot was not experienced with Antarctic flying and got a little bit disoriented as he was finishing his preliminary approach, made a bank to turn and didn't realize that he was very close to the ice. He thought he was higher in altitude, and a wingtip hit, and again the plane cartwheeled. But in this case, the pilot and co-pilot were killed, and there was one other person on the plane that died as well.
Wow.
And they were the first ones in that season. So all the other planes that followed soon after came in and saw this crashed plane. By that time, they'd moved it to the side. But those kinds of things they happened, and for inexperienced pilots, it was a great, great challenge. I mean, just one of many challenges.
I can imagine. Are a lot of the airplanes, a lot of them, Tom, are they retrofit to fly? I mean, the current. I mean, I know that even, of course, the conditions are horrendous down there. But I mean, I think even a commercial airliner, I don't know what the temperature is, but up at 40,000 feet, I believe it's below zero. Are a lot of these planes that are used today, are they specially built for that type of for those conditions down there? I mean, are there a lot of added features to them, if you will, to be able to fly and survive in those kind of temperatures?
Yeah, there are. The basic models that are used are similar to what would come out of the factory for normal use. But for example, our workhorse down there now is the LC-130, the Hercules. L indicates that it's ski equipped, and it's considered an add-on feature, although they've been building them certain models that way for many, many years. But they're retractable skis, so that when they take off on hard surface runways, asphalt runways, they use wheels. But to land then in snow conditions, they will drop down the skis, which have been retracted up to the belly. So the skis are below the wheels, and then they'll do the landing on skis. And that type of arrangement, it actually goes back quite a ways to the 50s and 60s. But the early R4Ds that were down there, that was the Navy's version of the DC-3, had a number of modifications that they made and made through experience. They did have skis. They were crudely retractable, and I say crudely because often things went wrong with the skis in the process of retracting them. But they also carried things like auxiliary fuel tanks, simply because of the great distances down And they had to be definitely specially equipped for navigation. That is one of the things that has been for many years one of the great challenges to aviation down there is navigation, because you can't really navigate by compass because the south magnetic pole is not at the geographic pole. Mm-hmm. It's some 700-800 miles away. So as you're approaching the continent, of course, your orientation with respect to the poles begins to vary widely. And in the earlier days, what they used was a combination of dead reckoning and what was called a gyro compass. And basically what that was, when they left New Zealand, the compass would be, of course, pointing toward the south magnetic pole. And that far away, they knew exactly how far that was off in degrees from the direction of true south. So the gyroscope built in together with the compass would take over. They would set it on that bearing. And that's what they followed to go south, because it would not vary. The gyroscope would not allow it to vary, although it did drift about, I believe it was a degree or so an hour. But they couldn't rely on a compass. And you could take sextant readings if there was something to observe, and oftentimes the weather prevented that. So it was a real challenge. And the second year, excuse me, the second year when the R4Ds went down from New Zealand, the last plane to leave, about halfway down, experienced a failure of the gyro compass. And there was not enough visibility to take sextant readings. So they were basically on their own, and they began to drift off. The plane ahead of them, which was piloted by Lieutenant Commander Conrad Shen, who eventually made the first landing at the South Pole, got radio word from the plane following that they had lost their gyro. He decided that he could turn back, pick them up, and use a frequency on their radios as a beacon. So they would essentially direction find on the radio. And he did that. Turned around, found him, and if he had kept going on his original track, he would have ended up in the Australian sector of Antarctica and crashed when he ran out of fuel. So he followed Lieutenant Commander Shen back to McMurdo, and eventually made a safe landing there 18 hours later. So that was an example of how difficult it was to get from point A to point B.
Wow. And I would assume, too, Tom, that one thing I've always thought is weather monitoring has probably got to be so critical, because it's not like, trying to land at LaGuardia. Well, if you get a snowstorm at, if JFK, you can divert to Boston, or you can divert to Maine, or you can divert to Philadelphia. Down there is no diverting, and there's probably no turning back. When you're there, you've got to have all the chips have got to line up for you, so that you have nothing unexpected, so you can set down.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Even today with the LC-130s, there is a what they call a POS, point of safe return, where you have enough fuel to turn back at that point, just barely. But if you go beyond it, then you're committed.
Right.
Because you're going to run out of fuel if you try to turn around. So you have to go in, and it doesn't matter what the weather conditions are. And that has happened many, many times where aircraft have had to make landings in 0-0 conditions or whiteouts or heavy storms. And then it's the skill of the pilot and also the guidance that they receive from the ground control operation. I was on actually a flight like that my last time down, where we hit bad weather about an hour before McMurdo and ended up landing out on the Ross Ice Shelf, what's called an open field landing. And basically the pilot just starts easing the plane down at a prescribed rate until they feel the skis hit.
Wow.
Because they really can't see anything in front of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Do they have actually marked out or groomed runways, Tom, or is it just here's the basic vicinity?
Yeah, there are marked and maintained runways. The McMurdo example, during the early summer, the ice is groomed, and they run maintenance machines over the surface to try to minimize the rutting and the unevenness of it. Then when the ice begins to break up, of course they fall back on what's called Williams Field, up on the ice shelf, and that is maintained as well. So they do have options.
Gotcha.
But that's also a pretty much a full-time job. There's a good story about the first group that were down there building. After they built McMurdo, the next big item was to create the ice runway so that the first heavy aircraft could come in the next season. They were planning to bring in the big C-124 Globemasters, and those needed to land on ice. They don't have skis, and so there was no option. So this CB crew spent weeks and weeks and weeks just before the sun came up again, grading and regrading this runway, and they had it, they thought, in pretty good condition. And then about 2 to 3 weeks before the first flights were to arrive, there was a horrendous storm. It lasted at least a week. And it destroyed all the work they had done. So they had to start again and work 24 hours a day for the next 2 or 3 weeks, and they got it done. They were, it wasn't as good as the original, but they had something that the aircraft could land on.
Yeah, because I would assume that the aircraft with the skis, it wouldn't be a problem. But again, I know there's a lot of airplanes that went in and just have conventional landing gear. That would have to be you'd have to have something to take care of that.
Yeah, and the C-124s were absolutely crucial because they were the only planes big enough to carry the materials that they planned to build South Pole Station with, as well as Bird Station. And so it was absolutely essential that they get those planes in. The smaller planes just couldn't handle that much cargo. So that was what they were facing, and the old CB motto is they'll get it done, and they did.
Exactly. Another couple questions that came in for you, Tom. Sky writes in. She's a listener that listens to us in the greater Pittsburgh area. She said, "What are Tom? What are your thoughts on speaking about ditching and what have you on MH370, the airplane that went missing?"
MH370.
Yeah, that's the one that went off the radar. And nobody has found this thing yet.
Was that the Indonesian plane?
Yes.
Yeah. I can't really comment on that. It just points out that even with all the sophisticated tracking and various other devices that we use now, we simply can lose aircraft. It's possible.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I don't have the background on that one.
No problem.
To be commenting in any serious way.
Another question from Carol in California, a great listener, sends in a question. Says, Tom, how is law enforcement handled in a territory that's not owned by nobody?
Very carefully. There are, each nation, I think, swears in what are considered to be law enforcement officials for their particular bases, and the U.S. does that as well. Who would have to basically if somebody is really out of line or commits some kind of crime there, that they can take charge of them and get them shipped back, in our case, to the United States for further judicial action. But there is no other law enforcement as such down there. There are no policemen.
Okay.
They're in the past, the military would handle things their own way for their people there. But by and large, it's there haven't been any real serious incidents that I'm aware of, or murders or that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Another question that came in for you from Red over in the UK. Red writes in, says, Tom, why don't they use heavy lift helicopters instead of planes? That would omit the need for hazardous runways. Are there aircraft? But I'm just curious. I wonder if there's helis that can make that kind of distance.
Well, I'm sure there are, but the biggest limitation is range. Their helicopters are, by their nature, more limited in the distances they can travel.
Yeah.
And the distances down there are enormous. So it really, the C-130s have occupied a very, very, very good niche down there for many years because they have the range, they have the capacity. True, you do need some distance to land on, but they actually can get into many places that have very limited runway access, or no runways at all. When it's a matter of delivering science parties out in the field, they typically will land on a piece of terrain that they've never landed on before. And there's a whole procedure that they go through in order to land safely, one of which is they'll make a pass and basically skim the top of the surface for two reasons. One is to assess the roughness of the surface, because it's often difficult to visually see that. Right. And the second reason is there's very often covered crevasses in many areas down there. So by skimming the surface and putting pressure on it, and sometimes that collapses these snow bridges, and the pilot can then see that no, that's not a particularly good place to land.
Right. Well, I think what you're doing. I think this, first of all, is I am not a filmmaker, but I work with. I have some friends that are filmmakers, and I think it's an art to what you do, and the independent filmmaker, especially with someone like yourself who takes these such interesting subjects and puts all this together in the research, and that's why I wanted to talk with you on the show tonight. Is just the vast knowledge you have the experience, but the knowledge and the digging into the historical side of this is just amazing, and it's a lot of work. And I would assume, especially you go back quite a ways in time, trying to find a lot of these individuals had to be a task in itself.
It's a challenge, especially in the early years. If you dig hard enough, though, there is information there, and there are people that you can locate. I was fortunate to have interviewed the last two survivors of the 1939-41 bird expedition, one of whom has passed away since. I've interviewed one of the three survivors from the Ronnie Antarctic expedition in 1946 to 48, and I hopefully will be interviewing a second member of that expedition this summer. But it points out what I think is what I hope will be the essence of this film, and that's people. These are the folks that lived the history, and if I do my job right, I want to have their story told by them as much as possible.
Right.
So that's my challenge as a filmmaker is number one, finding these people, but number two is conducting an interview in such a way that you're drawing the story out of them and allowing them to tell it to the greatest extent possible. And that's been such a joy.
Mm-hmm.
I came into this project with a bit of trepidation in the sense that the military community in general, there's a culture to it. The aviation community there's a culture to that, and there's even a subset of that in the Antarctic aviators. And they tend to be a close bunch. So I had some question as to how I would be received as an outsider. I'm neither an aviator. I've had experience in Antarctica, but I'm certainly not in the aviation community. But what I found was almost to a person, these folks were very welcoming and very open about their stories. And in fact, most of them really want the story told because their sense is that things have moved on and people have forgotten what they did, forgotten the history of the aviation down there in general. So it makes me it's a greater obligation on me to tell the story right. And again, to the greatest extent possible, I'm trying to allow them to do that.
Well, and they were the. I mean, I would say that today, and maybe I could make this statement. It's still a very treacherous, dangerous undertaking to go down there. It's not a typical flight like into a LaGuardia or a JFK, but time and technology has moved forward. But the earlier, before the days of GPS and it was more of a fly by not fly by wire but fly by feel, fly by cable, and in these older airplanes, every trip was I don't want to say it was an adventure. It was taking your life into your hands. Where today, even though it's dangerous, technology has obviously made it safer and safer. But back then, with no radar, I mean, you wouldn't even know whether there was a mountain in front of you or a big open field. It was probably every flight was a gamble.
Well, Antarctica hasn't changed. It's just as dangerous and forbidding as it was when the first explorers went down there. Mm-hmm. True, technology has improved a lot, but particularly in the case of aviation, you still have to know how to use that technology properly and make the right decisions under the right circumstances. Not often, I would say, but in some cases where crashes have occurred, it's been where the pilot has not believed the instruments he was reading. He wanted to rely more on what he was seeing, or she, because now there are female pilots. But that's the great danger. Is you may have all this technology at your disposal, but if you don't use it properly, you're still in trouble.
Yes, yeah, exactly. With some of the people that you interviewed, Tom, were there some cases, and I would assume so, were there some people that really were gung-ho about going down there and exploring down there, and then once they got there, they maybe, I wouldn't say realized they were in over their heads, but didn't realize the danger until they were actually living it?
I don't think it was so much the dangerous aspect of it. What you find with the folks that become aviators is that the ones that make it through, the good ones, they don't fear danger. They respect it and they prepare for it. But if they feared it, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. So, largely it's I find the attitude kind of unique. In one way, it's sort of that's the mission. We just do our job. I've heard that more than once. That you were facing all of these challenges. Well, we were just doing our job. And another part of it is, of course, that most of the flyers down there are relatively young. And when you're young, you tend to think of yourself as indestructible.
Sure.
It's just a natural thing. But the ones that go down, by and large, are well prepared for what they are facing.
Yeah. I think it's a fascinating subject. Your film now, you did a Kickstarter on it, and it I assume it funded to where you needed it to fund?
Beyond that, yes, it did very well.
Yeah. So is this going to be, when you finish this film up, is it going to be shown in theaters? Is it going to be released as a DVD? How will people be able to get to it?
I doubt that you'll see it on the big screen, simply because I've made a commitment to tell the story properly and as much detail as needed. So the longer version of the film will probably be between 2 and 3 hours, and just that alone would keep it out of most theaters. I have had some interest from our local public broadcasting television station in the Albany area. Mm-hmm. They would be interested in something about an hour in length, and that would have more concentration on the 109th Airlift Wing of the New York Air National Guard. And that's because that's the unit that is doing the LC-130 support for the U.S. Antarctic program now. They go down every year. I think they have 6 planes that they take down. So I think what will happen is I'll end up with a short version. And with a little luck, it will be shown at least on our local station. And it may, if there's enough interest, they've agreed to help promote it with some of the other public television stations around the country. So that may be one way that it could be seen. The other way is that I will be making it available on my website at www.gwillow.com. So it certainly will be there. And as I said, there'll be a longer version that it's not going to appeal to everyone, but if you're an aviation aficionado, and particularly Antarctic aviation, I think you'll find it fairly interesting.
Oh, I think it's. I think Antarctica is. It's a new. It's like another planet. It is so remote and so distant and so hostile yet beautiful. People have interest in it. I think it's just one of those subjects that most of us will probably never ever get there in our lives. It's one of those places in the world that most of us will never see with our own eyes, but yet films like this that can show the hostility of the environment and the beauty of the environment, but the hostility of it and what it takes to get people in and out of there, and again the pioneers and the dangers and all the people that tried and didn't make it, and then all the successes, all the people that were successful. I know I watched this, now this wasn't in Antarctica, but it was up in the Arctic. Several years ago, there was a program, I cannot think now, it's in the tip of my tongue, the group of people that found the B-29 up there on the frozen lake and managed to get it just about ready to fly, and then the the aft generator motor broke loose and it burned it right down to the ground. I don't know if you know I think it was called Snowbird.
Yeah, that was quite a story.
Quite a story, and it was shown in several parts. But what a lot of people didn't realize is the hostility of the environment. That didn't happen over a couple of months. I mean, that took years to get that ready to fly, and to again just the remoteness, and nowhere near the remoteness of Antarctica. But what it took to just get parts there and pull the engine apart, pull the engines apart piece by piece and bring them back, and bring a couple of propeller blades at a time, and what a feat! And I can't imagine trying to do that down in Antarctica.
Well, it has been done. There's a similar story. It's a fascinating story, and I'm going to be interviewing some people that were involved in it. Back in 1972, the U.S. was supporting a ice core drilling project in an area called Dome Charlie. It's over in eastern Antarctica. And in doing that, the station, or the core drilling station, was up above 11,000 feet on the plateau. So it was a difficult place to fly in to begin with. Well, they managed to crash or disable 3 different Hercules over the course of a couple of years at that station, and all but one they were able to get out with fairly quick repairs. The other one they deemed a total loss, and they just left it there. This was, I believe, 72. Well, as time went on, the National Science Foundation, who funds all of the Antarctic program, realized that it might actually be more cost-effective to try to go back and recover this aircraft rather than buy a new one, because the cost of the the 130s had gone up significantly. So 17 years later, they sent a team back in there and managed to dig it out. By then, it was under something like 30 feet of accumulated snow. Dig the thing out, completely remove the wings and replace those in the engines, and tow it up to the runway area. And they flew it out of there. And they flew it back to New Zealand, and eventually it was repaired and used again. And it was cost effective. It saved them about, I think, something like $7 or $8 million.
Wow.
So that was, recovering. Talk about the Phoenix. That it rises again.
Yeah, it's and what was, where did they dig that? I don't know if that was down in Antarctic, Tom. Where was they, Antarctica? Wasn't it the P-38 that they dug out of the ice, piece by piece, and now that airplane's flying again?
I don't recall that one, Pat. It doesn't ring a bell to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many of them. It's just so interesting, but the amazing feat of again anything to do with trying to rescue these airplanes in these hostile areas is just it's an unbelievable feat. What other? I know you don't have this film out, but is this the last one for you, or do you have some other things in your sights for down the road?
Until the next inspiration comes along, this one is keeping me busy. No, I haven't planned on a subsequent film. I take them one at a time and try to do them as best as I can. I wish Ken Burns were doing this, but with his resources and his skills. But he isn't, and he won't, and so I feel like I need to tell this story.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any desire or any plans to ever return back to Antarctica?
Oh, I would love to, at the drop of a hat. But
Really?
I don't realistically see any way for that to happen at this point.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not young anymore, and I'm not involved in projects that would allow me to go down there. So I live vicariously through things like this film.
Well, I mean, again, the people that were involved with these programs, they're not getting any younger, and so many of them are passing on. And
Exactly.
It's a great honor, and what I think you're doing is amazing, and it's an honor to be able to interview you, to talk about your work, but it's also an honor in what you're doing for those people so that their stories can live on into the future. I think it's amazing. Again, if someone like yourself doesn't do this, no one's going to hear the stories, and people need to hear the stories. They need to hear the history.
That's the urgency that I feel as well. And two of the people that I have interviewed in the last 5 months have now passed away.
Wow.
One of them I interviewed just 2 weeks before he passed.
Wow.
And that
Sad.
was Chief Petty Officer John Strider, who has the distinction of being the first American to set foot at the South Pole.
Wow.
When that first plane landed, he was the plane captain. And on those old R-4Ds, the first order of business for the plane captain once you're landed is to get out, and it's what's called pinning the landing gear. Just the design of the gear is such that if you didn't insert this stabilizer pin into it, it had a danger of collapsing. So that was the flight that Admiral George Dufek made, and sort of intimated that he was the first American to set foot on the pole. But in fact, it was John Strider, and I had the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Strider before he passed.
How interesting. Had to meet some interesting people in history to do this.
Yeah, fascinating stories. Just a wealth of them. My problem is going to be what to leave out.
Are you gonna put are you gonna by chance put it like a DVD together that maybe will be like a director's cut or a behind the scenes cut, and stuff that because that's what I find fascinating on most DVDs. You go to see the movie, but I like all the other stuff that surrounds it.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about it. We'll see when it gets down to the editing stage. I have pretty much decided that I will probably take all of the original interviews uncut and put them with a depository somewhere, either Byrd Polar Research Center or the National Archives, or some permanent place for them, so that the entire interview can be used, not just a portion of it.
Well, that'll be interesting. Tom, I want to thank you for giving us a couple hours tonight. It was such an honor and privilege to talk with you, and what you're doing is amazing. And I can't wait. Maybe I can talk you into sending me a DVD when you get it done. I would love to see the film. And after I see it, I'd love to have you back on again down the road and talk more in depth. Seeing is, just gives you that much more to cover, all these different interviews. But I think it's a great thing what you're doing, and it's an honor to those people. And again, I want to thank you for taking the time to be here with us tonight for the past couple hours.
Oh, it's been my great pleasure, Pat. The time has gone very quickly.
It has.
I can probably arrange to give you a preliminary copy.
I would love it. Tom, have a great weekend, what's left of it, and take care. Let's stay in touch, and I'd like to get you back on after it's released.
That sounds great, Pat, and I do appreciate the time, and thanks also to your audience, the ones that have sat through and listened to this.
Sounds good. Okay, Tom, good night, God bless, and be safe.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.